I'll guard you until my last breath. The mountain man vowed, while bandits hunted the teacher. The September wind came off the high ridge with a bite that promised early snow, rattling the loose panes of the one-room schoolhouse at Willow Gap. Children bent over their slates while the potbelly stove clicked and sighed, trying to keep up with the cold that seeped through the chinks. Miss Clara Hayes moved between the rows, steady and calm, her brown skirt brushing the raw pine floorboards. She had the kind of face people trusted, clear eyes, firm mouth, but there was a tiredness at the edges, a widow's quiet that never quite lifted. When the door opened, the room changed in one breath. A man filled the frame so tall he had to duck, hat in hand, shoulders broad as a barn door. The children stopped scratching numbers and stared. Even the stove seemed to hold its heat. He stood there a heartbeat, letting his eyes adjust to the lamplight. The town knew him by sight, if not by conversation. Elias Crow, the mountain man who lived higher than the timberline, where storms chewed at the roof and wolves printed the drifts. His coat smelled of smoke and cold iron. Scars crossed his knuckles like pale lightning. When he saw Clara, he took off his hat, his voice a low stone rolling down a creek bed. "Ma'am," he said, simple and respectful, "I need a word." Clara set her chalk down and told the children to copy their tables twice more. Her tone said there would be no foolishness while she stepped outside. She met him on the narrow porch where the wind worried the bell rope, and the grass hissed like a sea. Up close he was even larger, but he stood easy, as if he could shrink himself so as not to startle a skittish horse. Snow clouds stacked over the western ridge. The road into town ran empty. Elias looked at her the way a man looks at a storm he means to walk through. "I'll guard you until my last breath," he said. Not a flourish, not a courtship line. A vow laid down plain between them. Her heart knocked once, hard. She folded her hands to keep them steady. "That is a strong promise, Mr. Crow," she said, keeping her voice careful. "And a strange one to bring to a schoolhouse porch." "Strange day," he answered. He angled his body so he stood between her and the road, an instinct more than a show. 3 riders came down from Bear Notch last night. Same gang that took from the freight line in June. They're asking after me in the saloon, asking after you too. He let that settle. "Your late husband's debt was bought by a man who rides with them now. He'll use it for leverage property, safety, reputation. They'll twist whatever they can reach." Clara felt the cold differently then, sharp along her ribs. She had thought the cruel part of life was behind her. The winter blizzard that took her husband, the half-year of whispers that followed, folks counting how long a woman ought to mourn before she spoke of bread or beans, the quiet walk back and forth from cottage to school until the town's eyes slid away. She had weathered all that. But this was new men with long guns and no conscience, riding her name like a hook. "What do you want of me?" she asked. "For you to come up the mountain until the thaw," he said. "Cabin's stout. I can hold it. I'll bring you down to teach on fair days when I can watch the road. I'll see you safe from these men. That's the whole of it." She almost laughed then, a dry little sound that died in the wind. "Sir, we barely know each other." He nodded as if that were the answer he expected. "You know I keep my word. You know I pay for what I take and return what I borrow. You've seen me once or twice help a stuck wagon without being asked. I know you keep your students fed when their fathers forget, and I know you walk home alone with your head high. That's enough knowing for a start." The bell rope tapped the porch post like a nervous finger. Children's voices rose inside soft, obedient. She looked past his shoulder to the far aspens, their leaves going yellow, a shiver of light against the darker pines. It was a hard country. It liked people who chose quickly. "If I say no?" she asked. "Then I still watch," he said. "From a distance. But distance leaves room for fools. Best is you come now, before the passes close, and before men get bold with early dark." He reached in his coat and brought out a small object wrapped in a strip of buckskin. He unfolded it and showed her a tiny bird carved from ashwood, wings tucked, beak sharp. The grain ran like feather lines. "Hawk," he said, "made it years back. If it's in your pocket, I'll find you. If it's on your sill, I'll come at once." It was a strange gift and a tender one, both at once. She didn't take it. Not yet. "Why me?" she asked. "There are others in town easier served. Less trouble, less talk." He held her gaze, steady as a fence post in frozen ground. "Because you stand your ground without shouting, because a man's last breath ought to be spent on someone who has done the same all her life. Heat pricked her eyes, and she was angry at it. She didn't owe tears to a man she hardly knew. She looked away, toward the road, and thought of debts and names, of the winter to come, of her students tracing sevens into soft slate. She thought of how the town judged a woman who took a stranger's help versus a woman who was carried out at gunpoint. Both kinds of gossip cut the same. She could change very little about mouths that liked to wag, but she could choose the place where she would face the trouble. Not marriage, she said, the words fast and firm before the wind could blow them thin. Not marriage, he agreed. Protection, work, partnership if you want it. Your say, every step. Inside, a chair scraped. Little boots shuffled. The smell of iron stove soot sneaked out the cracked door. Clara drew a breath that tasted of snow. I will need to close my lessons early, pack my books, and leave word with the sheriff. I'll see to your trunk, he said. We ride at first light, take the south trail, less eyes there. A low wagon rattled far down the road, then stopped, then went on. The sound made the hair rise at the back of her neck. She reached for the wooden hawk and let it rest in her palm. It was smooth and warm from his pocket, lighter than it looked. I'll hold you to your promise, she said quietly. He settled his hat again, the brim cutting the light off his eyes, and for one breath he looked like a man who had stepped out of the timber to become a wall. You won't have to, he said. I'll hold to it without your asking. Then he lifted 2 fingers in a half salute and stepped off the porch, his stride long and sure, as if he could cover the miles to the mountain without ever tiring. She stood and watched him go, the hawk sitting on her heart like a second pulse. After a moment she went back inside, told the children to put away their slates, and said they would have the rest of the afternoon for drawing maps of the county so they'd learn the shape of home. They cheered softly, their breath little ghosts in the cool air. She walked between them and felt the room the way you do when you're about to leave it. Every scratch on the desk, every stain near the stove, every book she had bought with her own coins, all of it dear and ordinary and in danger. When the last child went out with a paper map rolled in a mittened fist, Clara locked the door and turned the key twice. The wind had freshened. She tucked the hawk into her pocket and lifted her eyes to the high timber. Something moved where the aspens thinned into spruce. Not a deer, not a gust. A man's outline, still as rock, watching the schoolhouse with a patience that felt like hunger. She did not flinch. She only drew her shawl close and began to pack, because fear was something you carried while your hands kept working. The sun slid behind the western ridge early that evening, leaving Willow Gap wrapped in a thin, copper-coloured twilight. The air smelled of chimney smoke and snow coming, and every sound seemed to carry too far, the creak of a shutter, the bark of a dog, the low clop of a horse's hooves on frozen dirt. Clara moved briskly through her small cottage, pulling items from drawers, folding them with the automatic neatness that comes from years of living alone. A pile of books grew on the table spellers, a battered atlas, the well-thumbed reader her pupils loved best. She hesitated over her late husband's Bible, worn soft at the edges, and slipped it under the stack. Outside, boot steps scuffed the boardwalk, then stopped. Clara's fingers tightened on the fabric in her hands. She reached for the oil lamp, turning the wick low so the light would not spill out the window, and listened. A knock came, quick and sharp, like someone trying to keep their visit unnoticed. She opened the door to find Sheriff Toller, his hat in hand, breath puffing in the cold. He was a wiry man with a lined face and eyes that always seemed to measure how much trouble you might bring him. "Evening, Miss Hayes," he said. "Elias Crow came to me, said you might be leaving town with him." Clara nodded. "There's trouble brewing, Sheriff." "You know it as well as I do." "I do," he admitted, shifting from foot to foot. "But I'll say this plain Elias isn't a man most folks would trust with a cat, let alone a woman's safety. He's been in fights. He's lived with the Utes and Winters. He's outside the usual." She gave a small, tight smile. "Sheriff, the usual hasn't kept those riders from circling." Toller scratched his jaw, then lowered his voice. 3 men came down the North Trail last night. One's a fellow named Pike, mean as a starving coyote. He's the one bought your husband's debt from that mining outfit. You're a mark to them now. If you're bound to go, I'll send word to the next post station up the pass, but you keep your eyes open." When he left, the street seemed emptier than before, the darkness thicker. Clara closed the door and leaned against it for a breath, letting her pulse slow. She thought of the figure she had seen at the edge of the trees after Elias left the schoolhouse. It had not been the sheriff. It had not been friendly. She returned to her packing, moving faster now. In the back of a cupboard, she found the small cedar box where she kept her few valuables, her mother's silver thimble, a ribbon from a county fair long ago, a cameo brooch chipped on one side. She placed the carved hawk beside them for a moment, studying its smooth lines in the lamplight, before slipping it into her coat pocket where her hand could find it easily. By the time she stepped outside, the wind had teeth in it. She latched her shutters tight and pulled her shawl close. The street was nearly deserted, save for a pair of ranch hands hurrying toward the saloon, heads down against the cold. Her boots echoed too loudly on the planks as she walked toward the mercantile. Inside, the store smelled of flour and lamp oil. Mrs. Dobbins, the owner, looked up from her ledger with a knowing glint in her eye. "You're going somewhere, Miss Hayes?" "Up to the high cabin with Elias Crow for a time," Clara said simply. She had no appetite for spinning stories. Mrs. Dobbins pursed her lips. "That'll set tongues wagging." "They'd wag no matter what I did," Clara replied, choosing a length of stout rope, extra lamp oil, and a packet of dried beans. She laid coins on the counter. "If anyone asks, tell them the school is closed until spring thaw." As she left the mercantile, a voice called from the shadow of the alley, "That's a long way up the mountain for a lady." Clara turned to see a man leaning against the wall, hat brim low, a smile that didn't touch his eyes. She recognized him from the description pike. The lamplight caught a jagged scar running from his ear to his jaw. "Best you mind your own road," she said, keeping her voice even. "Your road's about to get rough," he said, stepping forward into the light. "Man you're riding with has enemies enough to fill this whole valley. You tie yourself to him, you might end up with his fate." Clara met his gaze, her heart pounding but her chin high. Better to ride with a man who stands than bow to one who threatens. She turned on her heel and walked away, feeling his stare between her shoulder blades until she reached the corner. When she got back to her cottage, a tall shape waited in the dim Elias, holding the reins of 2 horses, steam curling from their nostrils. "We leave now," he said quietly. "Snow's coming quicker than I thought, and Pike's been asking after you in the open." She didn't argue. Her trunk was already strapped. He lifted it to the pack horse like it weighed no more than a sack of grain. The night seemed to close in as they rode out, hooves muffled in the dirt, the town's few lanterns winking behind them. The trail wound between black pines, the moon a thin knife overhead. Elias rode slightly ahead, his broad back blocking the wind, checking the shadows like a man used to being followed. Clara kept one hand near the hawk in her pocket, its smooth curve grounding her. Somewhere behind them, far enough to be uncertain, came the faint crunch of another set of hooves. She looked over her shoulder but saw only trees. Elias slowed his horse until she was beside him. His voice was low, almost lost in the wind. "Don't turn again, just keep steady. If they mean to come, they'll do it where the trail narrows." Her pulse thudded in her ears, but she matched his calm. The trail ahead climbed toward the ridge, where snow already lay in streaks like pale scars across the rock. Somewhere beyond, the cabin waited stout walls, a fire, and the uneasy safety of being alone together with danger just outside the door. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke from somewhere too close to be the town. Elias's jaw tightened. "They're closer than I thought," he murmured. "We'll see if they follow past the first switchback." Clara tightened her grip on the reins, the hawk warm against her palm. Whatever waited up the trail, she would meet it. The mountain was dark ahead, but it was away from Pike's eyes, away from the alley shadows, and for now that was enough. The first flakes began to fall as they reached the lower switchback, drifting lazy as ash before the wind caught them and flung them into their faces. Elias leaned forward in the saddle, his shoulders hunching against the cold, the leather of his coat creaking with each shift. Behind them, the steady crunch of following hooves faded, then came again, closer this time. Clara felt the hair at her nape lift. The darkness in these mountains had a way of pressing in on a person, filling every gap between the trees until you swore you saw shapes that weren't there. Elias lifted a hand without looking back. She slowed her mare to match his pace. "Trail splits ahead," he said, his voice little more than a breath in the snow. "Main Pass runs east, my way turns north. If they're tracking us for trouble, they'll take the east where they've got room to run. But if they're after us and not the freight line, they'll keep north." They reached the fork, their horses' breaths puffing in great clouds. Elias guided his gelding up the narrow north trail without hesitation. Clara followed, glancing once over her shoulder into the white murk. Two silhouettes emerged from the pass below, paused, then one lifted a hand. She couldn't see their faces, but she knew they had seen hers. The climb was steeper now, the path a thread clinging to the side of the mountain. Below, dark treetops swayed in the wind like the backs of restless beasts. The snow was thicker here, stinging her cheeks, coating her mare's mane. Elias kept his eyes moving, checking each bend before they rode into it. At one curve he dismounted and led both horses, testing the footing with his boots. "Rocks under the snow," he said. "Don't want a broken leg this high up." As they pushed on, the forest closed in spruce and fir heavy with white, their branches sighing under the weight. The air smelled sharp, clean, and underneath it all, faint wood smoke again. Clara caught it as they rounded a boulder, and her hand went to the carved hawk in her pocket. Elias smelled it too. She saw the way his shoulders stiffened. "There's a line cabin a mile ahead," he said. "Trappers use it when they can't make the pass. If someone's in there now, they'll have a fire going." He didn't have to add the rest. In this country, a warm fire could mean a friend or someone who wanted you to think so. By the time they reached the clearing, dusk had thickened into a kind of bruised darkness. Snow muted every sound except the pop of burning pine from inside the small, crooked cabin. Light leaked through the gaps in the shutters. Elias tied the horses to a sheltered pine and motioned for Clara to stay back. He moved like a shadow himself, stepping to one side of the door, his hand resting easy but ready on the rifle slung across his chest. A creak. Then the door opened. A man's face appeared in the glow-bearded, younger than Elias, eyes too quick. "Crow," he said, the name flat as a statement, not a greeting. "Didn't expect company, Sam," Elias answered. Sam's gaze shifted to the darkness where Clara stood. He smiled, but it was the wrong sort of smile. "You bringin' schoolmarms up the trail now?" "Passing through," Elias said. "We'll camp outside." "No need," Sam replied, stepping back to show the fire inside. "Plenty of room." Elias didn't move. "You alone?" Sam's pause was just a fraction too long. "For now." Elias gave a slow nod, as if he'd read all the words Sam wasn't saying. "We'll be on our way. Snow's light yet." They left without further talk, the warmth of the fire vanishing behind them as quickly as it had appeared. Clara's questions burned in her throat, but she held them until they'd put another mile between themselves and the cabin. Only when Elias stopped to check the horses' girths did she speak. "You knew him?" "Sam Pollard," Elias said, brushing snow from his coat. "Used to trap with him. Learned too late he traps men as easy as foxes. He'd sell your trail to the highest bidder." Her stomach tightened. "You think he'll tell them?" "I think he already has." They pushed harder after that, the snow deepening around their boots when they dismounted to lead the horses up a final steep grade. By the time they reached a narrow gap in the ridge, the wind had teeth in it again. Elias pulled a small battered lantern from his pack, shielding the flame with his palm. Not far now. The cabin appeared almost by surprise, tucked into a fold of rock and timber, its roof heavy with snow. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. Elias opened the door and ushered her inside. The heat from the stone hearth wrapped around her like a quilt, carrying the scent of spruce logs and old leather. The walls were lined with shelves of jars beans, dried fruit, venison jerky. A table stood in the centre, scarred from years of use, and a single rocking chair waited by the fire. Clara stepped inside, her boots sinking into the fur rug spread over the plank floor. Elias closed the door against the wind and hung his rifle on pegs by the hearth. "Safe here," he said, though his eyes still flicked once toward the shuttered window. She moved to the rocking chair, running her fingers along the smooth armrest. "Yours?" she asked. "My mother's," he said, his voice softer now. "Broke one leg years ago. Fixed it so she could sit by the fire in winter. Figured you might want it more than I do." Clara sat, the chair creaking under her weight in a way that was oddly comforting. For the first time that day, her hands stopped shaking. She took out the hawk from her pocket, turning it over in the firelight. "If I keep this in sight, you'll find me," she said. Elias met her eyes. Always. Outside, the wind shifted again, and under it, faint but sure, came the sound of hooves in the snow. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Elias crossed to the window, pulled the shutter back a finger's width, and peered into the darkness. He let it fall shut and came back to the fire, his face unreadable. "They didn't lose us," he said. "They just let us get comfortable." The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing shadows that reached up the log walls like grasping hands. Clara sat still in the rocking chair, her fingers curled around the carved hawk, the wood warm from her palm. Elias moved with quiet precision, laying his rifle across the table, checking the chamber, then setting out cartridges in a neat row. His expression gave nothing away, but the small, deliberate movements told her he was measuring the hours ahead like a man who'd lived through worse nights. "They're out there now?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but she felt the weight of the dark pressing against the cabin walls. "They're out there," he said, "close enough to watch the chimney smoke, close enough to think they have time." He glanced at her. "That's their mistake." The wind keened around the eaves, and a fine dusting of snow sifted in through the gap under the door, pooling white against the plank floor. Elias crossed to it and dropped the heavy bar into place. "Only way in here without my say is through the walls," he said, "and that's a loud business in the dead of night." Clara rose and began unbuttoning her coat, forcing herself into the rhythm of the place. She hung it on a peg and set her books on the desk in the corner, an island of order amid the wild country outside. "If they mean to take me," she said, "they won't stop for noise." Elias's mouth quirked, not quite a smile. "That's why I'm here." He moved to a storage chest and began pulling out gear, a coil of rope, 2 lanterns, a small bundle wrapped in waxed cloth that he set beside the cartridges. Clara watched as he worked, noting the care in every placement. There was nothing frantic about him, only a solid, measured readiness. "Best we keep the fire low," he said after a moment. "Too much light will blind us to the dark." He leaned in and banked the flames until the cabin was lit in a softer glow. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the sharper tang of cold iron from the rifle. Clara tried to settle herself, but every creak of the logs, every shift in the wind made her ears strain. She thought of the schoolhouse, the familiar scrape of chalk, the children's voices rising in unison. It felt far away now, like a story she'd once read instead of a life she'd lived. Elias returned to the table and sat, his chair angled so he could see both the door and the shuttered window. He pulled a small knife from his belt and began whittling at a block of cedar, the shavings curling away to fall on the floor. The steady rasp of the blade was almost soothing. "Keeps my hands busy," he said without looking up. "What are you making?" she asked. He shrugged. "We'll see when it's done. Might be nothing, might be something to carry." They passed the next hour in that quiet Elias shaping wood, Clara pretending to read one of her books but hearing instead the faint crunch of snow beyond the walls. Once, a horse snorted, the sound muffled but close. She glanced at Elias, but he only set down the knife and picked up the rifle. "They're testing the ground," he said, "seeing how close they can come without spooking us." A soft knock came at the door, 2 quick taps, a pause, then one more. Clara's breath caught. Elias stood, every muscle gone still. "Stay here," he said, and crossed the room. "Who's there?" His voice was low, even. A man's tone answered, casual, almost friendly. "Cold night, Crow. Thought we might share your fire a while." "Not my fire to share," Elias replied. "And you're not my company." The pause that followed was long enough for Clara to hear her own heartbeat. Then the voice came again, harder now. "You've got something that belongs to us." "You're wrong," Elias said. "Twice over. Nothing in here belongs to you, and no one here is yours to take." Bootsteps crunched away into the snow, slow and deliberate. Elias waited until they were gone before turning back to Clara. "They won't come straight in. Men like that like the slow squeeze. Think it makes you careless." Clara met his gaze steadily. "And will it?" "Not tonight," he said. They ate a quick meal, beans warmed over the low fire, bread from a cloth-wrapped loaf Elias had brought down from a higher cache. Clara found she was hungrier than she realized. The warmth and the food loosened the knot in her stomach, but outside the night deepened, and with it came a new sound, the faint metallic ring of an axe biting into frozen wood. Elias froze mid-bite, listening. "They're cutting sign into the trees," he murmured. "Marks to track where they've been." She pictured it trees scored with rough symbols, warnings or claims. "So they mean to stay close." "They mean to tell me they're not going anywhere," he said. Message received. When the axe blow stopped, the silence that followed was worse. The wind had dropped, leaving the night so still she could hear the faint groan of the snow-laden roof. Somewhere in that stillness she imagined she heard breathing hers, his, and maybe another's. Elias stood and crossed to the rocking chair, pushing it gently until it moved in a slow rhythm. "Sit," he told her. "If they look in through the chinks, they'll see you calm and know I'm still inside." She took her place, the chair swaying under her. The hawk was in her lap, her hand covering it like a talisman. Elias moved into the deeper shadows near the door, rifle resting easy but ready. The minutes stretched into an hour. The only sound was the faint creak of the chair and the whisper of cedar shavings settling on the floor. Clara kept her breathing steady, her eyes on the fire's glow, knowing that somewhere just beyond its reach, men were watching, waiting, deciding how and when they'd come. She thought then of his vow on the schoolhouse porch. "I'll guard you until my last breath," and for the first time since leaving Willow Gap, she believed he meant every word of it. And outside, the snow kept falling, covering every trail but the one that led straight to their door. By dawn, the snow had settled into a heavy quilt over the world, muting even the usual creaks of the cabin. Clara woke to the dim grey light that seeped in through the shutters and the smell of coffee. Elias stood at the stove, moving with the same quiet efficiency as the night before, though there were new lines of fatigue around his eyes. His coat was already on, dusted with snow, a sign he'd been outside before she stirred. "You slept," he said, without looking over. "Some," she replied, sitting up and pulling her shawl tighter. The rocking chair had cradled her through the worst of the night, but she still felt the stiffness in her back. "You?" "Enough." His tone told her it wasn't true. He set her, steaming tin cup on the table, tracks all around the cabin. They circled us like wolves. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her fingers. Why not come in? They had the night, the numbers. "Because they're not here for a straight fight," Elias said. "They want us off balance. They want to see how long we'll sit still before we make a mistake." He crossed to the window and lifted the shutter a finger's width, scanning the tree line. 2 of them stayed. The rest went down toward the pass. "My guess is they'll come back with more." Clara sipped the coffee, bitter and strong. "Then what's the plan?" He glanced at her, measuring her as if she were part of the ground he needed to understand. "We hold for now. I've got snares set in the drawers and deadfall traps on both approaches. But if they push before we're ready, we take the narrow trail to the high ridge. Hard going, but I know every turn." She thought of the cliffside path they'd ridden to get here, how her mare's hooves had skidded on the ice even under Elias's steadying hand. The idea of climbing higher, into thinner air and deeper snow, was daunting. But the alternative, waiting for Pike's gang to break through, was worse. After a breakfast of dried meat and hard biscuits, Elias showed her the layout beyond the cabin. He'd cleared sight lines from the windows to the lower slopes, cutting back branches so they wouldn't give cover to anyone approaching. He pointed out the stack of firewood against the north wall. "If they set fire to this, the wind will carry it straight into the cabin. If that happens, we take the ridge trail, no hesitation." Clara followed him through the snow to a narrow cut between 2 boulders. He pointed with his rifle barrel to a shallow trench partly hidden by drifts. "Deadfall," he said. "Step there and you drop into a pit lined with sharpened stakes." She looked at him, startled. "You've had all this ready?" "Not for you," he said. "For anything that comes hunting me, wolves, men, makes no difference." The wind tugged at her shawl, sending a shiver through her. "You've lived like this for years?" He didn't answer right away, scanning the slopes with narrowed eyes. Long enough to know the mountain takes the soft out of a man, and the soft out of anyone who stays near him. They returned to the cabin, boots heavy with snow. Inside, Elias removed his coat and went to work at the table again, spreading out a strip of rough paper. It was a hand-drawn map, marked with ridges, gullies, and small X's. "They'll come from here," he said, tapping a gully below the cabin, "or here, the south slope where the wind's in their favour." Clara studied the map. Could they come from both? His eyes lifted to hers. They could, which is why you'll keep the rifle. She blinked. "I've never." "You'll learn," he said, matter of fact. "The gun will kick. Hold it tight to your shoulder. Sight along the barrel. Squeeze. Don't jerk. You aim for the man giving orders." The hawk was still in her pocket, and she found her fingers curling around it again, as if it might steady her the way his voice did. She nodded. "Show me." They spent the next hour with him walking her through the motions loading, aiming, bracing her stance. He didn't crowd her, just corrected the angle of her elbow, the tilt of the barrel. "You've got a good eye," he said once. "Better than some I've hunted with." The practice was cut short by a sound from the trees, a single deliberate crack. Not the sharp report of a gun, but wood splintering. Elias's head came up fast. "They're felling something," he said. "Could be clearing a path. Could be making a ram." A knot of cold settled in her stomach. "Then it starts." "Not yet," he said, though his voice was tighter now. "They'll let the idea of it sit with us a while. They think fear works like frost, slow, steady, creeping in until it freezes you solid." The day crawled by. Elias kept to the shadows by the window watching. Clara tended the fire, careful to keep it low, and set about small tasks that kept her hands busy mending a tear in her skirt, sorting beans. Outside, the forest was too still, the snow swallowing every sound except for the occasional creak of a laden branch. By late afternoon, the grey light had deepened. Clara was sorting the last of the beans when she caught movement, a flicker between the pines. "Elias," she said quietly. He was at her side in 2 steps, peering out. A figure moved along the edge of the clearing, wrapped in a dark coat, head down as if studying the snow. When he looked up, she saw the flash of a grin, white, sharp, knowing. Pike. Elias didn't raise the rifle, only stepped back from the window. "He's counting heads," he said. "Wants to see if we've got help." "He'll know we don't," Clara said. "Then he'll decide when to press." Elias's jaw tightened. "But he'll want to talk first." "How can you be sure?" "Because men like Pike like to hear themselves promise what they'll do to you before they do it." As if on cue, a voice rang out from the trees. "Crow! You can't keep her forever." The words hung in the cold air, a challenge and a warning both. Clara glanced at Elias, but he was already moving to the door, his expression carved from the same stone as the ridge above them. "Stay inside," he told her, "and remember what I said. If the fire goes up, take the ridge trail, don't wait for me." Clara tightened her grip on the hawk. "I won't leave you." He looked at her then, just for a moment, something unguarded in his eyes. "You might have to." Then he stepped out into the snow to meet whatever Pike had brought up the mountain. The cold met him like a wall, biting through even the thick wool of his coat. Snow crunched under Elias's boots as he stepped out into the clearing, each movement deliberate, showing no hurry, no fear. Pike stood a dozen paces away, a dark slash against the white, his coat flaring open to reveal the butt of a revolver at his hip. 2 other men flanked him, both holding rifles at an easy angle that wasn't fooling anyone. "Crow," Pike drawled, as if they were neighbours meeting on a road instead of adversaries on the edge of a fight. "Heard you've been playing house with the teacher." His grin was thin, teeth bared against the cold. "Sweet arrangement you've got up here. Warm fire, good company. Shame it can't last." Elias didn't move closer, only planted his feet and let the snow settle on his hat brim. "State your business." Pike tilted his head, pretending to think it over. "She's mine, by debt and by right. Her late husband owed more than his life could pay, and I bought what he left behind. That includes her." Inside the cabin, Clara's grip tightened on the hawk until her knuckles ached. She couldn't hear every word, but Pike's voice carried enough to make her stomach turn. "She's not yours," Elias said evenly, "and debts don't buy people." "That's rich, coming from a man who lives off what the mountain gives him for free." Pike's smile sharpened. "I'm not here to argue law, Crow. I'm here to make it easy. Hand her over, and I'll let you keep your cabin and your skin." "No," Elias said. Pike's grin faded. "You think you can hold me off forever? Snow's coming heavier every day. You'll run out of wood, run out of food. She'll get tired of being snowed in with a man who don't talk much." Elias's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the cold like a clean blade. "I said no." Pike's hand twitched toward his revolver, but he didn't draw. Not yet. Instead, he looked past Elias toward the cabin, knowing she was inside. "You hear me in there, schoolmarm? This is your last chance to walk out on your own 2 feet." Clara's heart hammered, but she stepped to the door, lifting the latch before Elias could stop her. The cold hit her lungs like a slap, but she kept her chin high. "I'm not walking anywhere with you," she said. Her voice rang clear across the snow. Something flickered in Pike's expression. Annoyance, then something darker. "You think he can keep you safe? You think he's not going to cut and run the first time the odds turn?" Elias didn't look at her, didn't take his eyes off Pike. "You've had your say," he told him. "Now go before you overstay your welcome." Pike's smile returned, but it was cold and thin as ice on the river. "We'll be back before sundown tomorrow. I won't ask again." He turned, his men following him into the trees, their dark shapes swallowed by the snow and the pines. Elias waited until they were gone before he turned to Clara, his jaw tight. "Don't open that door again unless it's me." She met his gaze steadily. "I wasn't going to let him speak for me." His eyes softened just a fraction. "You didn't." Inside, the air seemed warmer after the exchange, but it was an illusion. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls holding in not just heat but the knowledge that the clock was running. Pike had given them a deadline, and men like him kept their word about such things. Elias went to the table, spreading the map again. "Tomorrow they'll come in force," he said. "More men, maybe rope or ladders to scale the north wall. They might try to smoke us out." Clara moved to stand beside him. "And if they do, then we use the ridge trail," he said. "But if we can, we hold. Every day we keep them here is another day the snow deepens. Sooner or later, the mountain will be on our side." The rest of the day was spent in quiet, purposeful work. Elias split more wood, stacking it inside where it couldn't be fired. Clara checked the stores, laying out what could be eaten without cooking if they lost the fire. She found a small tin of dried apples tucked behind the flour sack and set it aside, a small comfort for the hours that would come. In the afternoon, the wind picked up, whistling through the chinks despite the moss stuffed between the logs. Elias took a strip of canvas from the storage chest and tacked it over the shutters, muting the light and sealing in more heat. "Less chance they'll see our shadows moving," he explained. They ate early stew made from jerky and beans, filling and hot. After, Elias sat by the fire with his rifle, methodically cleaning it. Clara watched him in the shifting light, the way his hands moved with certainty, the way his eyes kept straying to the door without him realizing it. "You've done this before," she said quietly. His gaze lifted to hers. "Something like it. Different men, different reasons. And you made it through." His mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Not everyone did. The wind outside shifted, carrying a faint sound with it. Hooves again, distant but approaching. Elias set the rifle down and crossed to the window, lifting the shutter just enough to look out. His voice, when it came, was low but certain. "They're closer than they should be this soon after leaving." Clara's pulse jumped. "Scouting? Or laying something in place for tomorrow?" He let the shutter drop. "Either way, we keep the fire low tonight, and you keep the hawk where you can reach it." The hours stretched long as darkness fell. Snow thickened, plastering the walls and muffling every sound. But under that blanket of quiet was the knowledge that Pike's promise was ticking down with each breath. Clara sat in the rocking chair again, her hand on the hawk, watching the fire's glow flicker over Elias's face as he kept his silent vigil. Outside, unseen beyond the shutters, the mountain gathered its cold and its silence around them, waiting to see who would break first. The night pressed in heavy, so still that Clara could hear the faint hiss of snow sliding off the cabin roof. The fire burned low, its light turning the room into a warm island adrift in a sea of cold. Elias sat by the window, one knee drawn up, his rifle balanced across it. He hadn't spoken in over an hour, but his eyes never stopped moving, tracking the shadows beyond the shutter as though the dark itself could shift. Clara had given up trying to read, and instead watched him, the way the lines of his face hardened when the wind shifted, the way his shoulders eased only slightly when it died down again. She knew better than to ask if he was tired. Men like Elias didn't admit to tired when danger was close. A sound broke the stillness, a muffled thunk against the north wall. Not loud enough to be a battering, but purposeful. Elias was on his feet in a breath, his hand signalling her to stay put. He crossed to the corner, listening, then leaned to the shutter and peered through a narrow crack. "Rope?" he murmured. Her breath caught. "They're climbing," he shook his head. "Setting lines for tomorrow. Makes it faster when they rush." He stepped away from the window, his voice calm but clipped. "We're cutting it now." Clara stood, unsure. "You mean to go outside?" "I mean to make sure they don't have the advantage when the light comes." He pulled on his coat and checked the knife at his belt. "You bar the door behind me. Don't open it unless I call twice, then once." She followed him to the door, the hawk clutched in her palm. "If something happens—" "It won't," he said, though his eyes held hers longer than the words needed. "Keep the fire low, watch the back wall. They might try more than one trick tonight." He slipped into the storm, the door closing with a soft thud. Clara slid the bar into place and stood with her back against it, listening hard. The cold seemed sharper without him inside, the cabin quieter in a way that made every creak of wood feel like a footstep. Minutes stretched. Once, she thought she heard the crunch of boots circling the far side, followed by a faint scrape steel on wood. Then came the unmistakable snap of rope fibres parting. She imagined him moving like a shadow along the wall, cutting each line before they could anchor it, the snow swallowing his steps. When the knock came, 2 quick raps, pause, then one, she nearly sagged with relief. She lifted the bar and let him in. Snow dusted his hat and shoulders, melting into dark patches on his coat. "They'll know it's gone by morning," he said, shrugging off the cold. "That'll rattle them." She poured coffee into the tin cup, pushing it toward him. "And if it makes them come sooner?" His eyes met hers over the rim as he drank. "Then we deal with them sooner." The rest of the night passed in uneasy quiet. Elias stayed near the door while Clara dozed in the rocking chair, waking at every shift in the wind. Once, near dawn, a faint whistle sounded from the trees. 3 notes, rising and falling. Elias's head came up, his hand closing on the rifle. "Signal," she whispered. "Between them," he said. "Means they're close enough to see the cabin." The first light of morning was thin and flat, showing nothing but snow and the dark smear of pines. No movement, no sound but the groan of trees under their burden. Still, Elias didn't relax. "They'll wait for the sun to warm the air a little," he said. "Cold makes a man clumsy." Clara stirred the embers in the hearth, coaxing a bit more heat into the room. She felt the tight coil of anticipation in her chest. Not just fear, but the knowledge that whatever happened next would change everything. Either they would hold, or they would be driven up the ridge into deeper isolation. Elias moved to the map again, tracing a path with his finger. "If they come from both gullies at once, you take the rifle and watch this stretch here." She nodded, committing the direction to memory. They ate in silence, bread and cold venison, quick and filling. Clara noticed the way his hands moved with deliberate calm, as if slowing himself might slow the day's events. But when the first distant crack echoed from the tree's wood, splintering, his eyes sharpened. "They're clearing the last cover," he said, standing. "Once it's gone, they'll rush." Clara rose too, feeling the weight of the rifle in her hands. She had never fired at a man before, but the thought of Pike's grin, of his claim over her life, pushed away the hesitation. The sound of breaking wood stopped. The forest went silent again. Then came the crunch of boots on packed snow, many at once, moving in steady rhythm. Elias glanced at her once. "Remember, breathe, sight, squeeze." She nodded. The hawk was in her pocket, its familiar curve under her fingertips. She didn't know if it was a promise or a prayer, but it was enough. Shapes emerged from the tree line dark against the white, spreading out as they advanced. Pike was at the front, his coat open, his smile fixed on the cabin, like a hunter closing in on his quarry. Elias's voice was steady. "Wait until they're close enough to see their eyes." Clara braced herself, the barrel steady against her shoulder, the cold air burning in her lungs. Outside, Pike lifted a hand, and the line of men halted. He called out, voice carrying clear and sure, "Crow, this is the part where you make the smart choice." Elias didn't answer. The silence stretched, heavy with snow and breath, and then Pike's hand dropped. The charge began. They came on fast, boots pounding over the snow, shouts rising as the cold air filled with the smell of powder and sweat. Pike led them like a man certain of his victory, his eyes locked on the cabin. Elias didn't move until the first 2 broke from the line and sprinted for the north wall. Then his rifle cracked once, clean and precise. One man spun and fell. The other dove for cover behind a drift. "South Gully!" Elias barked, already chambering another round. Clara swung the rifle, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She sighted down the barrel, saw a figure climbing the slope toward the cabin's blind side, and squeezed. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she saw the man drop his rifle and slide back into the snow. A shout rose from Pike's side, more men surging forward. Elias moved like a man born to this fight, his shots measured, never wasted. "Reload," he called, and Clara's fingers worked clumsily at first, then faster as muscle and need took over. Snow exploded from the north wall as an axe bit deep into the logs. Elias swung to the door, braced his boot, and fired through the gap, the shot muffled but deadly. The axe fell silent. "Stay with me," he said, moving to the window. Through the narrow slit she could see Pike still standing, still smiling, though it was tighter now, his men faltering each time one of them went down. Then Pike whistled. 3 sharp notes, and from the tree line came a sight that made Clara's blood run cold. A boy, no more than 12, stumbled into the open, a rope around his wrists. One of Pike's men shoved him ahead, using him as a living shield as they advanced. Clara's stomach turned. "He's from the valley," she whispered. "One of my pupils." Elias's jaw tightened. "They think we won't risk the shot." His eyes swept the field, reading it faster than she could follow. "We go now, while they're tangled up in their own game." He slung the rifle over his back and grabbed the coil of rope from the wall. "I'll draw them off. You get the boy." "I'm not leaving you here," Clara said, her voice hard as the frozen ground. "You're not," he said, meeting her eyes. "We'll both make it if you trust me." The hawk was in her hand before she even thought about it, the smooth wood pressing into her palm. She nodded. Elias kicked the bar from the door and burst into the clearing, moving low and fast toward the ridge side. Pike shouted, his men's aim swinging toward Elias as he fired twice in quick succession, dropping one, forcing another into cover. Clara slipped out behind the south wall, her boots silent in the deep snow. She kept low, circling toward the boy. He saw her and froze, fear and hope battling in his eyes. She pressed a finger to her lips, then cut the rope at his wrists with Elias's knife. "Run for the cabin," she whispered. "Don't stop." He bolted small and quick, weaving through the drifts. Pike roared, spinning toward him, but Elias was already there, stepping between them. Pike fired. The shot rang out sharp and close, and Elias staggered but stayed on his feet, his own rifle coming up. Time slowed. Clara saw the way Elias's broad frame shielded the boy, the dark bloom spreading across his coat, the way Pike's eyes widened as he realized his shot hadn't dropped him. Then Elias fired once, and Pike went down hard, his grin gone forever. The rest broke. Without their leader, they melted back into the trees, dragging the wounded, leaving only the churned snow and the sharp tang of gunpowder. Clara reached Elias as he sank to one knee, his breath ragged. She caught him under the arm, her shoulder taking his weight. "You're coming inside," she said, no room for argument in her tone. He gave her a faint smile, pained but real. "Told you I'd guard you." "And I told you I wouldn't leave you," she said. They made it back to the cabin, the boy safe inside, shaking but unharmed. Clara pressed Elias into the rocking chair, tearing open his coat to find the bullet had grazed his ribs, bloody but not mortal. She worked quickly, binding the wound with strips torn from a sheet, her hand steady even as her heart thudded against her ribs. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the tracks, softening the world into silence again. Inside, the fire's glow caught on the carved hawk resting on the table between them. Elias's hand found hers there, his grip warm and certain despite the fight they'd just come through. "Spring will come," he said, his voice low, "and when it does, we'll walk out of here together. No one will take that from us." Clara met his gaze, the weight of everything unspoken between them settling into something solid. The mountain had tested them, and they were still standing. And though she didn't say it aloud, she knew the truth of it now. His vow wasn't just a promise for this winter, but for every day that followed.